The goal for this video is to teach you exactly how I studied the PMBOK 6th edition and to go over the resources that I used to understand the process mapping workflows, which ultimately helped me pass my PMP exam. If you haven't already watched my 7th edition PMBOK review, I recommend you watch that video first before this one, as that one has more higher level themed content. It can help you get more familiar with some of the principles that we'll be talking about in this video. If that sounds helpful to you, continue watching. Huge shout out to Ricardo Vargas again for creating the 6th edition process mapping guide. This resource alone, in addition to his video that he made on YouTube, was super helpful to watch in helping me understand the process mapping workflows. His YouTube video is 1 hour in duration, and I know not a lot of you have the time in order to fully watch that video. So the goal for this video is to cover all of that content, to provide you with examples, and to do it in the most efficient way possible. So hopefully this video is less than an hour long. Let's get straight into it. All of the guides and resources that I use, I'll link in the description of the video so you can check that out. Material-wise, I think it's really good to have a physical copy of the process mapping workflow that Ricardo created. So what I actually did was I printed out his simplified guide and then physically mapping out the steps so that they made sense in my head. So in this video, I'll actually map out the entire guide and go over the content with examples. So the first phase of every project is called the initiation phase. I actually made an entire video breaking that down, so I'll link it here if you want to check it out. But basically, there are two main things that happen here that are really important. The first of which is developing the project charter. At its simplest form, it means some type of contract between you and the client that confirms that a business agreement's happening, that confirms the client will be paying for services, and houses all the logistical and legal stuff. There are many contracts that can be signed here. Some examples are like a master service agreement, which is an MSA. It's a more formal, overarching document. There could be a statement of work, which is an SOW. During this time, there are many legal contracts being signed, and as a project manager, your job is to make sure you get that information from your sales team and from your legal teams to make sure that you fully understand what those documents are, because usually they'll house a lot of really good details that can help you get ahead on your project planning. So in addition to reviewing any business documents and agreements, use this time to really think about what is the structure of the organization you're dealing with. So use this time to think about any cultural considerations, any big projects or external factors the client's currently working on, and any major partners the client's currently working with. Not saying you'll be able to pull all that information at once, but it could be helpful to think about. Basically, the project charter, it formalizes that there is business being done between yourself and the client, and it's necessary that this is signed before you start a project, because you don't want to be doing free work, and you want to make sure all that legal and logistical information is already finalized before you start a project. Okay, we'll move on to identifying stakeholders. So let's take a step back. You're in the initiation phase. You've gotten that formal legal document saying that you can now work with the client. What do you do next? In order to start the project, you should probably figure out who you're working with, right? That's probably a pretty important piece. So that's where identifying stakeholders comes into play. It's good to start thinking about who later on you may need to work with, and also who should be receiving project updates as the project moves further along. Use those two guiding questions to help you determine who are the right stakeholders. Once you've identified a preliminary list, put that in some type of stakeholder register that you've created for your team. In the stakeholder register, it's good to record the stakeholder's name, their position, their title within the organization, their email, their cell phone number, and any other personal details that may be helpful throughout the project. So after you've completed those steps, you now move from initiation to the planning phase. Okay, congratulations, you've made it to the planning phase of a project. This is arguably one of the most intense phases for a project manager because a lot of work needs to be done. So you're juggling so many different factors, there's so many different things that you need to think about. How do you keep track of all this? Well, a project manager uses something called a project management plan. So a project management plan is basically a big plan that has a bunch of smaller plans housed within it. And the goal here is to keep track of all these little things to make sure your project is as successful as possible. So let's break down that project management plan. So you're in the planning phase. What are some things that you should think about? Well, when I think of a project, usually I like to know what is the deliverable or what is the client expecting at the end of the project. One thing that can really help you there is something called the scope plan. Scope really means what is expected to be done within the project. Oftentimes you'll hear things like out of scope, within scope. That basically means if things are being added to the project or if things are no longer a part of the project. So within scope, there are a couple of things that are really important to consider. You need to plan the scope management plan. And really what that means is taking that initial project charter, breaking that down into what the deliverable is. Usually that's a great guiding way of defining your scope management plan. So how do you define what the scope is? Well, from that initial contract, start thinking about what the requirements are and record those down into a list. From those requirements, you'll be able to define what the scope is for the project. And once you've identified the scope for the project, you can break that down further into smaller chunks that are more manageable for your teams to actually work on. So those smaller chunks we call the work breakdown structure, or WBS. And basically what that means is, let's say for example, you're a construction company that's building a house for a new client. If the overall goal is to build a house, there are a lot of different parts that need to happen in order for that to be successful. So you need to have someone to lay the foundation. You need to have someone do the plumbing, the electrical work, and all the other small things that need to be considered. So with the work breakdown structure, for the foundation, you can break that down into what are the materials that need to be gathered, how many people it takes in order to lay the foundation, what is a timeline for that to be done. Super helpful to think big picture and drill down into more details from there. Okay, so for planning, you've already thought about the scope. What next? Well, it's probably important to think about the timelines in which the project will be done, right? So in that case, you're thinking about the schedule. So planning for the schedule. So schedule management really means thinking about how long the entire project will take, taking that duration and then breaking it up into shorter chunks to know what work needs to be done at what time. So once you've thought about the schedule and the timelines, let's break that down further into defining what the activities are or what work needs to be done. So for the construction example, let's say you're building a house for a client. What are the activities that need to be done? Well, you need to gather resources, you need to assemble a team, you may need to lay the foundation, you need to think about what teams will need to be responsible for building the roofing of the house, for building the sides of the house, for interior design. There's a lot to think about. So think about all those activities, and once you've got a list of those, it's time to then sequence those activities in the correct order. So for our example here, it probably doesn't make sense that you have your teams focus on the roof before the foundation's even laid, right? Doesn't make sense whatsoever. In the same case, really think about what the end deliverable is, and then break that down into the activities and the order of events that need to happen. Oftentimes things can be done in parallel, which means at the same time. Use the planning phase to really think about the order of operations and what work needs to be done. After you've fully prepped all those materials, you should have a schedule that is fully planned. Alright, so you're on a roll. You've got the schedule and you got the scope already planned out. What else do we need to consider here? Unless you're volunteering, you're probably not going to be doing work for free, right? So it's important to think about planning for the cost. In our example with the construction company, thinking about the cost for physical labor, so assembling your teams, the cost for any vendors that you'll need to work with, the cost for the raw goods that you'll need to buy, so all that lumber, all the roofing, the shingles, the nails. Thinking about the cost of any tools you'll need to rent, so whether that's, chainsaws, anything like that. Think about any technology that you'll be using or that the client will be using. I like to first review the contracts to see if there's a certain amount that the client's already agreed to pay for. From there, you can backtrack to see how much wiggle room you have in order to get the project done. So we covered the cost, the schedule, and the scope. What else are we missing here? Well, for a project to be done, you'll probably need a team in order to do it, right? So plan for your resources. So whether that's planning for the specific raw materials you'll need or the actual labor that you'll need in order to get the job done. Start thinking about the scope and the scale of the project, and you'll likely need to do some estimating on the amount of labor that you'll need in order to get the job done. So let's say in our example, as a construction company, you want to build this house for a client, but your team only specializes in actually building the foundation and the structure. Let's say you guys don't have any electricians or any plumbers, and the client's really expecting the house to be fully functional. So what do you need to plan for here? You'll probably need to contract with some third-party vendors, whether that's electricians or plumbers, and use their services to get the job done. This is where the procurement management plan comes into play. Procurement really means getting resources from either other people or other things in order to get the job done that your team can't do by itself. Procurement can take a very long time, so you'll want to get this started as soon as possible. So with our example, if you're building a house for a client in a brand new location that you're not familiar with, you'll first probably want to check around and see what the local rates are for the electricians and plumbers. Once you've gotten those rates, there'll probably be some type of negotiation or process where you'll figure out if they have the timing and the right services in order to help you with this project. Assuming you've been able to find a couple of vendors that can do the job, you'll then want to select the one that's the best fit for the project. This again is another cost that you'll need to put into your cost management plan. So as you can see, a lot of these plans, they build off of each other, but they're all very important to think about. So what else do we need to plan for? Well, things always happen in life. Whether it's people getting sick, things getting broken, you never know in life. It's probably a good idea to think about planning for risk. So really thinking about how to best avoid things from becoming actual issues. So to start things off, identify what are the risks that could happen. For that construction project, if your vendor gets sick, if your electrician gets sick, well, there's not going to be electricity at the house. So maybe having a backup vendor in case. Think about all those different things and try to categorize them into whether they're qualitative or quantitative risks. After you've been very considerate with your list, start thinking about what are some responses to those risks that can help prevent them from becoming actual issues. As a project manager, it's really important to think about all those different components. So we've already prepared and planned for a lot of things. We're feeling pretty good. I think we're still missing a couple of really important things though. So we've already gotten the resources, the scope. We have a good idea about what the project will look like, but how are we going to communicate these changes and updates with our stakeholders? How are we going to make sure that the work we're doing is actually being noticed and tracked? Well, that's where coming up with the stakeholder engagement plan and communication plan are really important. Starting with the stakeholder engagement plan, this goes back to really understanding who your stakeholders are, how they like to operate. Switching gears over to communication, it's really important to think about the different communication strategies, not only for your internal teams, but also for the client stakeholders. Internally, what is the culture like at your team? Do folks on your team like meeting in person? Do they prefer getting updates via email? In a society where we have a lot of virtual meetings, start thinking about how to prevent meeting fatigue on your teammates while also getting the information and communications across. Okay, and last but not least, you'll want to probably plan for the quality of the project as well. So quality management. So why is that important? Well, in our example, if you're building a house for a client and the house, it just sucks. It's not functional. The doors don't work. The plumbing's terrible. The lights don't turn on. Do you think the client will be happy with that? Probably not. I'd be pretty upset if I were a home buyer. So in that case, you'll want to prepare ways in which you can test the quality of your deliverable as you move throughout the project. Whether that's having testing phases and thinking about the specific criteria that you want to test, but also thinking about what are the performance metrics you'll want to keep in mind. What are the things that the client really cares about that you need to make sure meet that standard? Okay, so as a project manager, you've done your due diligence, you've planned as much as you can for the project. Now we're at the executing phase. This is honestly one of the most exciting parts of a project because you actually get to see the work being done. So there are a couple of things here to consider. First is executing your resources. The teams that you prepared for, all the raw goods that you prepared for, any procurements from third-party vendors that you prepared for. Now is the time for you to go out and assemble all those together to make sure the work can be done. So when it comes to your team, that means getting them engaged, getting them trained and up to speed, and then managing your team long-term to make sure the project is a success. During the executing stage, you'll want to manage your stakeholders, making sure that your stakeholders are engaged throughout the process. So whether that means showing up to meetings, offering their input, giving their feedback on the project and how things are going. All that's really important to make sure the final deliverable is exactly what they want. During this time, you'll also want to manage any communications. So you've already planned for the types of communications and strategies that you'll use with your internal and client teams. You'll constantly be adjusting, and if you do so, document them and make sure that any updates get relayed to all your teams. As always, it's important to start managing the quality of the work being done and also to implement any risk responses as risks arise. All that to say, during the executing phase, you are getting the project work done, which is one of the most important parts of the project. And as you learn new things that come up during the project, whether they are risks, issues, or even good feedback, you'll want to document that and to have some type of repository that you and your teams can refer back to. And that's what we call managing your project knowledge. On a side note, the executing phase is one of my favorite parts of a project because things get really exciting here. You get to actually build something that was not previously there. After your teams have fully executed on building out the work needed for the project, you'll then be in the monitoring and controlling phase. Think of this phase as you're making sure that what you've built is, first of all, working and functional, and also it's something that is being maintained long term. So a lot of the factors that we've talked about during the planning phase, instead of putting plan in front of that factor, change it to monitor or control. So for scope, you're going to be controlling the scope, assuming that you've already built what was agreed upon in the contract, what the client wanted. Oftentimes, clients want more. Once they see the great work you've been doing, it's not uncommon for them to want to add on more things. During this time, really sit down with your organization and think about how you want to handle those types of requests. So control what is within and outside the bounds of your project. You'll also want to be testing to make sure that you're hitting all those points in order to reach that final deliverable. So validating the scope. As the project continues to go on, you'll want to be controlling and monitoring the cost and the schedule as well. It's very likely that the costs that you initially planned for end up being a lot higher than what was in your initial plan. So thinking about ways in which you can control the costs, being creative, being flexible, understanding what your teams are doing, and adjusting as needed. For the schedule, really monitoring the timelines in which you hope to get each activity done. If there are certain delays, try to see if you can get other things done during that time. And throughout that process, be very transparent with your clients to make sure that they're in the loop. So there are a lot of other factors here. Monitoring stakeholder engagement. You want to make sure that your key stakeholders who are making those decisions, who are signing off on those deliverables, they're still being engaged, they're still providing feedback, they're liking what's being done. You want to control your procurements. So if you're working with third-party vendors, making sure that they're getting their job done. Close out any contracts once they've been executed. Close any loops, make sure you're being very aware of the costs that are coming into play. For any communications, make sure you're continuing to monitor those as people bring up risks, as issues arise. Make sure that those are being resolved. If your clients have any feedback, make sure you're taking that in and you're adjusting as needed. Overall in this phase, the most important parts are you are fully responsible and fully engaged in all aspects of the project, making sure that things are being completed as expected, but also as changes arise, you're putting on your thinking cap and being really critical about the decisions you make. So during the planning phase, you should have already thought about how you're going to deal with scope changes or just changes in general. You should have already put those plans into action and making sure that those plans are being effective. When you were planning your resources and your teams in the planning phase, you should have already started thinking about what the long-term support team looks like, who should be contacted, and during the monitoring and controlling phase, you'll want to start introducing those counterparts, start getting them comfortable with the project work, and reassure the client that they're in great hands. So ideally during the monitoring and controlling phase, your transition team will already be introduced, and they'll be working together with you to make sure the transition is a smooth handoff. So it's been months now. Your teams have been grinding it out, their blood, sweat, and tears invested in the success of the project. The client's been providing great feedback. They're loving the results so far. You're nearing the very last phase, and that is the closing phase. So the closing phase consists of a couple of things. The first of which is you'll want to really finalize and make sure that your project work is meeting the expectations in any deliverables that were agreed upon in the contract. So reviewing the quality of the work, the data that you've obtained, and making sure that your client stakeholders are happy with the results. Assuming your deliverables and work have been going well, then you'll want to make sure that any internal documents have been updated and are in a great position to transition to the next team. The way I like to think about it is, your documents should be so up to date that anyone should be able to see the history from the start of the project to the very end, to be able to see why things were done. So when it comes to any changes, any risks, any issues, how you and your teams resolve them throughout the process, having that documentation is crucial to make sure that your transition team is very well aware of the next steps that need to happen. It's very common that there's some type of post-mortem or final report that you'll give to your transition team. Essentially, this is like a nice summary of everything that happened throughout the implementation, and it can help get your teams up to speed really quickly. During the closing phase, you'll have that one last call to the client, and then your transition team, who's already been engaged during the monitoring phase, they'll take that baton and they'll run with it and continue that great support for the client. Last but not least, if there are any lessons learned from your project, feedback good or bad, take the time to really sit down with your teams and share all of that and house it in an internal repository so that for future projects, you and your teams will be able to learn from those and won't make the same mistakes. Okay, so overall, that is a summary of the PMBOK 6th edition. I hope you found this video useful in covering at a really high level the process flow and the main factors that you should consider when owning a project as a project manager. As always, if you have any questions, please comment below, like and subscribe to continue learning with this channel, and we'll catch you all in the next video.